Hello, welcome. There is something in the human heart that recognizes Samson even before his story has barely begun. We do not need to have shattered armies or torn city gates from their hinges with our bare hands to feel the weight of his life. We know what it is to carry a gift that seems larger than our character, to sense a calling we have not yet learned to hold with care, to discover in the quiet places that the strength others see on the outside does not always match what is happening deep within. Samson entered the world marked by God for something extraordinary. From the very beginning, the Spirit of the Lord stirred within him. His shoulders bore power unlike any other in his generation. His hands performed feats that became legend. The strength God placed upon him was visible, undeniable, and awe-inspiring. For a time, he walked as one set apart, a deliverer raised up for his people in a season of heavy oppression. And yet, the story that unfolds around this remarkable gift is not mainly a tale of triumph through strength. It is a story about what happens when great power is not matched by wisdom and surrender. It is the slow forging of chains, link by link, compromise by compromise, small surrender following small surrender, until the man who once shook the foundations of his enemies sits blind and bound in a prison of his own making. It is also, in the end, a story of mercy that reaches a man in the darkest place and refuses to leave him there. In this quiet hour, walk gently with Samson. His story is older than yours. His failures take a different shape than yours. Yet the God who met him in his deepest weakness is the same God who meets you tonight, patient, compassionate, and still writing beauty, even from the most broken chapters of a life he has not finished redeeming. The story of Samson begins long before he drew his first breath, in the quiet home of a woman whose arms had never held her own child. Her hope had grown thin through years of waiting and wondering. Her ordinary afternoon was gently interrupted by a presence far beyond the ordinary. The angel of the Lord appeared to her, not to a priest in the sanctuary, not to a recognized prophet, to a woman whose name the Scripture does not even preserve, known to us only as the wife of Manoah from the tribe of Dan, carrying the particular sorrow of barrenness in a world that often measured a woman's worth by the sons she bore. The angel's message was clear and full of wonder. You will conceive and bear a son. Then came the words that would shape his entire life. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. A Nazirite from before birth, set apart not by his own decision or effort, but by God's own choosing. The uncut hair would stand as a visible sign of an invisible calling. This child belonged to the Lord in a special way. His life was marked for a purpose larger than himself, a deliverer raised up in a time when his people groaned under Philistine oppression. He entered the world already wrapped in divine intention. The Spirit of the Lord would stir in him from an early age. Strength beyond his years would rest upon him. Yet what he would do with that sacred purpose would become one of the most instructive and heartbreaking stories in the book of Judges, a tale of extraordinary gifting, human frailty, slow compromise, and the relentless mercy of God that refuses to abandon even the most wayward of his chosen ones. As Samson grew into manhood, the Spirit of the Lord moved upon him with power that was unmistakable and often overwhelming. This was not strength built through training or natural ability. It was something entirely other, divine power resting on him in ways that set him apart from every other man of his time. In the vineyards of Timnah, he met a young lion. With his bare hands, he tore it apart as easily as one might handle a small thing. He told no one. Later, at his wedding feast, he built a riddle around that same lion. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. The 30 Philistine companions at the feast could not solve it until they pressured his bride with tears and threats until she revealed the answer. Samson's response burned with the fury of a man who had rarely been denied anything his strength could seize. He struck down 30 men, took their garments, and used them to settle the wager. This pattern runs quietly beneath the early chapters of his life. The strength was real. The spirit truly moved. The victories were genuine. Yet threaded through them all was a troubling tendency. Samson increasingly treated the divine power flowing through him as an extension of his own desires rather than a sacred trust to be held in humility and surrender. He caught 300 foxes, tied torches to their tails, and released them into the Philistine grain fields, an act of spectacular vengeance wrapped in the language of war. When the Philistines bound him with fresh ropes, the Spirit came upon him again. He snapped the cords like thread and, with the jawbone of a donkey, struck down 1,000 men. Moments later, parched with thirst, he cried out to God for water, as if moving from fierce destruction to desperate dependence required no reflection on the difference between them. Samson was the strongest man in the story, yet in the ways that matter most deeply, he remained one of the least examined, carrying extraordinary gifting while his character struggled to keep pace. The power was undeniable. The wisdom and surrender that should have guided it were slower to grow, and in that gap, the seeds of future sorrow were already quietly taking root. In Gaza, surrounded by enemies who waited to kill him at first light, Samson rose at midnight. With quiet power, he tore the city gates, hinges, posts, and bar from their place. He lifted them onto his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill before Hebron. It was a feat that should have ended in gratitude, in prayer, in sober wonder at what God had preserved. Instead, the story moves straight from those gates to Delilah, as though one act prepared the way for the other. The man who had carried the gates of a city was about to begin carrying something far heavier toward a far more painful end. Delilah did not hide her intentions. The lords of the Philistines offered her a fortune, 1,100 pieces of silver each, to discover the secret of Samson's strength. She began pressing him immediately. 3 times Samson played with her, giving false answers with the easy confidence of a man who had never truly been bound. Fresh bowstrings, new ropes, braiding his hair into the loom. Each time the Philistines lay in wait. Each time he woke and broke free without effort. Yet something inside him was slowly eroding, not his strength, but his discernment, his ability to see danger clearly, his willingness to walk away from what was harming him. Again and again the pattern repeated. She questioned him. The enemy came to the door. He escaped, and still he stayed, as if the accumulating evidence of betrayal was not enough to move him. This is pride in one of its most dangerous forms. Not loud boasting, but the quiet assumption of a man who had never been defeated and had therefore stopped believing defeat was possible. He had broken every rope. He had walked out of every trap. He had carried city gates on his shoulders. He was Samson. What could truly touch him? Finally, worn down by her persistent tears and accusations that he did not truly love her, he surrendered the secret. If my head is shaved, my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. He told her everything. Then he laid his head in her lap and fell asleep. They came for him while he slept. The razor moved across his head. The 7 locks of hair that had marked him as set apart from the womb were cut away. When Delilah called out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson," he rose as he always had, expecting the familiar surge of strength, ready to shake himself free as before. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Those 5 words fall with devastating weight across the story. He did not know. He had grown so used to the power being present that he no longer paused to consider its source. He had so completely confused the gift with his own identity that the departure of the giver did not immediately register. He stepped toward the waiting Philistines with the confidence of a lifetime of victories, and discovered, in the most terrible moment, that the strength was gone. They seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They bound him with bronze fetters and set him to grinding grain in the prison at Gaza, the same city whose gates he had once torn away and carried on his shoulders. The humiliation was thorough and precise. The man who had never been bound was now in chains. The man who had always seen his enemies clearly was now blind. The champion who had struck down thousands was reduced to the labor of an animal, grinding grain for those whose fields he had once destroyed, a spectacle for their entertainment. In the darkness of that prison, alone with the consequences of his choices, Samson's hair began to grow again. In the great temple of Dagon, the Philistines gathered to celebrate their victory. The house was full. 3,000 men and women crowded the roof alone. Lords from every Philistine city had come. The people who had lived for years in fear of Samson now brought him out to mock and entertain them. They placed him between the 2 central pillars that held up the entire structure. Samson turned to the young man who was leading him by the hand and asked him to let him feel the pillars so he could lean against them. In the space between that request and the prayer that followed, the text gives us no words. We are left to imagine the thoughts of a blind man standing between those massive pillars while the laughter and taunts of thousands washed over him. What we do here is the prayer that emerged from that darkness, the most honest prayer Samson had ever uttered. Gone was the pride, the assumption of entitlement, the casual confidence that had marked so much of his life. In their place was simple, stripped-down dependence. O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once. Not a command, not a demand. A humble plea from a man who had finally learned he could not assume anything. Remember me. The words of someone who knew he may not deserve to be remembered, yet asked anyway. God answered. Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars, one with his right hand and the other with his left, and cried out with all the strength that had returned to him. The pillars gave way, the temple collapsed. The lords of the Philistines, the thousands who had gathered to mock, all of them fell in the ruin of Dagon's house. The dead he killed in his death, the text tells us, were more than those he had killed during his life. His brothers came and carried his body home. They buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. In the end, Samson's greatest victory did not come through the strength he had once taken for granted. It came in the moment he finally surrendered it completely to the God who had given it to him in the first place. Even in his deepest failure, the mercy of God found him and used his life to deliver Israel one final time. Samson was marked by God before he drew his first breath. He was gifted with strength beyond anything his generation had known. Yet he wasted much of what had been entrusted to him. Driven by desire, pride, and the growing arrogance of a man who had rarely faced consequences he could not overcome with force, he treated the sacred as ordinary. He held the covenant like a personal possession rather than a holy trust. In the end, he sat blind and bound in a prison of his own making. Even there, in the deepest darkness, the God who had set him apart from the womb had not finished with him. Samson's story holds together a difficult paradox without softening it into something more comfortable. He was genuinely gifted and genuinely flawed. His victories were real. His failures were devastating. The grace that reached him was never cheap. It cost him his eyes, his freedom, and nearly his life. Yet that grace proved sufficient for the honest prayer between the pillars and for the final act that delivered his people one last time. He is not a hero to imitate without careful reflection. He is a mirror held up for honest examination. In his life we see both the wonder of God's calling and the danger of carrying divine gifts without the humility and wisdom needed to steward them well. And the God who met Samson in the prison is the same God who meets each of us in our own hidden places of failure and regret. He is patient, he is present, and he is never finished writing the story, even when we are convinced we have already written its ending. In his hands, even the most broken chapters can still bear fruit for his glory and the good of his people. The era that produced Samson was marked by a single recurring sentence that echoes through the book of Judges like a diagnosis still awaiting its cure. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This was not a time of spiritual depth or national strength. It was a season of painful cycles that repeated with heartbreaking regularity. Israel would drift into the worship of the gods of surrounding nations. God would allow an oppressing power to rise and press heavily upon them. The people would cry out in their distress. God would raise up a judge, often flawed, unlikely, and morally complicated, to bring deliverance. Relief would last for a generation. Then the cycle would begin again. Samson was born into one of the most difficult turns of this wheel. The Philistines had become a formidable presence along the coastal plain. They were a technologically advanced sea people who brought iron weapons and tools into a region where Israel still worked mainly with bronze. Their military edge was significant, and they guarded it carefully, preventing the Israelites from learning the secrets of iron production. With organized armies, fortified cities, and systematic control, their oppression was steady and heavy, especially on the tribes of Dan and Judah. It was into this specific season of suffering and spiritual drift that the angel of the Lord appeared to a barren woman from the tribe of Dan. In her ordinary home, he announced that the son she would bear had already been set apart by God. This child would begin to confront the Philistine threat. His life would carry a divine purpose from the womb, a calling to bring relief to his people in their time of need. The world into which Samson came was fractured and unstable. The people did what was right in their own eyes. Yet even in that darkness, God was already at work, raising up a deliverer, marking him before birth, and preparing to move through his life in ways both powerful and heartbreaking. The Nazirite vow was a special form of consecration laid out in the Book of Numbers. It involved setting oneself apart for God through 3 clear commitments: abstaining from wine and strong drink, avoiding any contact with the dead, and leaving one's hair uncut. In most cases, it was a voluntary, temporary season of heightened devotion. Samson's Nazirite calling was different from the beginning. It was not chosen by him. It was declared over him before he was born. It was not for a limited time. It was meant to shape his entire life. And it was not primarily a private spiritual practice. It was a public, visible sign that this child belonged to God in a unique way. The most noticeable mark was his uncut hair. In the world of the ancient Near East, such visible signs carried deep meaning. Anyone who saw Samson's long hair understood that he was set apart. The extraordinary strength he carried was not his own possession. It was the outward expression of an inward covenant relationship with God, a reminder that his life was meant to be governed by consecration rather than personal desire. In this, Samson mirrored the larger story of Israel itself. The nation had been set apart by God, marked by covenant, and called to live differently from the peoples around them. Their identity was meant to be visible to the watching world as the people who belonged to the one true God. Both Samson and Israel walked parallel paths. Both had been chosen and marked. Both struggled with the gap between being set apart by God and actually living set apart for Him. And in that space between calling and character, between gift and surrender, some of the most honest and instructive lessons of their stories unfold. Samson's life holds 2 important truths together that are both fully real and often difficult to hold in the same heart at once. The first is the remarkable patience of God. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson again and again throughout his story. Not once in a single dramatic moment, but repeatedly, even as his choices revealed a pattern of carelessness toward the covenant that should have caused God to turn elsewhere. He pursued Philistine women against the clear boundaries of God's people. He touched a dead body and ate honey from its carcass, breaking his Nazirite vow. He used the strength God gave him more often for personal revenge than for the deliverance of his people. And still, the Spirit kept moving. This is not a picture of God approving Samson's behavior. It is a picture of God working through a deeply flawed person with a patience far greater than any human would likely offer. He accomplished his purposes even when the instrument he used cooperated only imperfectly. The second truth is the real and costly consequence of living outside the covenant. God's patience did not shield Samson from the natural outcome of his long pattern of compromise. The prison in Gaza came, the blindness came, the humiliation of grinding grain in the dark came. Every small surrender had quietly added another link to the chain that eventually bound him. In the final moments between the pillars, these two realities met. Blind and broken, Samson prayed the most honest prayer of his life. O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once. It was no longer the prayer of a man assuming he deserved God's help. It was the prayer of a man who knew he did not, yet asked anyway. God answered. Strength returned, the temple fell, and in that moment, Samson's life pointed forward, imperfectly and at great cost, to the perfect deliverer who was to come. The one whose consecration to the Father was complete, the one whose surrender was wholehearted, the one whose death between the pillars of human sin and divine justice would bring down not a single temple, but the entire power of the enemy over God's people. Samson began a deliverance. Jesus would finish it. In the space between the two, we see both the patience that keeps reaching and the holiness that calls us to live as people truly set apart for God. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that comes with extraordinary giftedness, one that is nearly invisible to others because it hides behind the very strength that makes a person remarkable. Samson carried this vulnerability in its clearest form. His physical power was so far beyond anything his generation had known that it slowly shaped how he saw himself. Over time, it created a quiet, unexamined belief that the ordinary rules and dangers that applied to everyone else did not quite apply to him. He had broken every rope that tried to bind him. He had walked free from every trap. He had carried city gates on his shoulders and defeated 1,000 men with a simple jawbone. What limitation, he seemed to think, could truly hold him. When giftedness is not anchored in deep humility and daily dependence on God, it can slowly distort the soul. It produces a person who has been so often spared ordinary consequences that they lose the ability to see danger clearly. Samson heard Delilah repeatedly asking for the secret of his strength and treated it like a game rather than a warning. He mistook the lack of immediate consequences for the absence of any consequences at all. In Samson, pride did not always shout. It often whispered. It was the quiet assumption that he would always be able to shake himself free as before. It was the failure to examine the repeating pattern in his life. It was the choice to remain in the room when wisdom was gently urging him toward the door. This is the hidden trap that can come with great gifts. The very strength God gives can become the thing that keeps us from recognizing our need for Him, until the moment when the strength is gone and we stand face to face with how much we always depended on the giver. Samson's life whispers a careful warning to every gifted heart. The greater the gift, the deeper the need for humility, surrender, and constant abiding in the one who gave it. Beneath the visible pride, something more tender and deeply human was at work in Samson. His repeated pursuit of Philistine women, women outside the covenant, relationships that consistently ended in betrayal and pain, was not mere rebellion. It was the restless searching of a man trying to fill an emptiness that strength alone could never satisfy. He could tear apart lions and break through armies, yet he struggled to choose relationships with wisdom. He struggled to hold healthy boundaries when emotional pressure came. He struggled to walk away from the very person working to destroy him. The long interaction with Delilah paints a clear picture of how manipulation takes hold in a heart that is both proud and emotionally hungry. She did not overpower him with force. She wore him down with persistent tears, repeated accusations that he did not truly love her, and the steady pressure of someone who understood his vulnerabilities. His pride would not let him admit fear. His longing for her approval slowly overpowered his instinct for safety. 3 times he gave her false answers. 3 times the Philistines lay in wait. 3 times he broke free and still chose to stay. With each return, the wall protecting his heart grew thinner. In the end, the text tells us he was worn down, not cleverly deceived, not overpowered by superior strength, simply worn down. The strongest man in Israel was brought low, not by force of arms, but by the quiet vulnerabilities his great physical power had never been forced to face. Samson's story gently reminds us that even the most gifted among us carry hidden wounds. The places where we feel most empty can become doorways for compromise unless we bring them honestly to God. True strength is not the ability to break every chain with our hands. It is the courage to surrender our hearts daily to the one who alone can satisfy the deepest longings within us. In the prison, something more important happened to Samson than anything else in his entire life. It happened in complete darkness, in chains, in the grinding, humiliating repetition of turning a millstone like an animal for the entertainment of his enemies. Stripped of his sight, his freedom, and the physical strength that had defined him for so long, Samson had nothing left to lean on except the truth he had long avoided. He had always been dependent. The power was never truly his. It had been given by God, and when it was withdrawn, the man left standing in the dark was someone who had never learned to live without it. The prayer he offered between the 2 central pillars carries special weight because of what it reveals. O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once. It was not the bold declaration of a man who felt entitled. It was not a demand from someone used to getting his way. It was a simple, humble, undignified plea from a broken man who had finally run out of self-sufficiency. In that prison, Samson began to learn the lesson he needed most. Not the restoration of his former power, but the gift of genuine dependence. A surrender that was honest rather than forced. A prayer that asked rather than assumed. True strength, the story shows us in its most painful and honest moment, does not look like Samson tearing a lion apart or carrying city gates on his shoulders. It looks like Samson between the pillars, blind, humbled, and at last willing to ask. In that place of weakness, he came closer to the heart of God than he ever had in the days of his greatest victories. And in that honest dependence, God met him one final time. The destruction in Samson's story did not come suddenly. It grew slowly, quietly, through the steady accumulation of small choices that seemed reasonable in the moment, each one adding weight to a life that was gradually becoming unsustainable. His repeated pursuit of Philistine women formed the most consistent pattern of compromise. The covenant God gave to Israel had drawn clear boundaries around relationships, not out of mere custom, but because the people we bind our hearts to shape the direction of our lives. Samson crossed those boundaries again and again, carrying the quiet confidence that his extraordinary strength somehow exempted him from the consequences others faced. It did not. Each relationship pulled him further from the people he was called to serve and drew him closer to those who sought his destruction. By the time Delilah appeared, Samson had already spent years training his heart in the very vulnerability she would later use against him. His anger also left deep wounds. Time after time he responded to personal offense with overwhelming force, burning Philistine fields, launching campaigns of vengeance. These acts triggered cycles of retaliation that harmed people far beyond those directly involved. The Philistines burned his wife and her father in response. Innocent lives were lost because a man of immense power chose to treat his rage as sufficient reason for actions he could not contain. This is one of the most dangerous realities of great giftedness without wisdom. Its consequences do not remain private. They spread outward with a force equal to the gift itself. Samson's compromises cost him far more than he could see in the moment. They cost him trust. They cost him alignment with God's purposes. And in the end, they cost him his freedom, his sight, and nearly his life. The story does not hide these costs. It lays them before us with sobering honesty so that we might learn from them while there is still time to choose a different path. The damage that flowed outward from Samson's choices may be the most sobering part of his story. It reveals that no compromise stays truly private. Its consequences always touch others. Samson had been set apart before birth to begin delivering Israel from the hand of the Philistines. That deliverance was delayed for years. Opportunities were missed. Personal vendettas took the place of sustained leadership. The people groaning under Philistine oppression waited while Samson pursued relationships that pulled him away from his calling. Real men, women, and children lived under the heavy weight of foreign rule, people whose suffering Samson had been raised up to address. His giftedness and their hardship existed side by side for much of his adult life, and the scripture records this painful reality without softening it. The cost reached its deepest point in the temple of Dagon. The Philistines gathered in triumph to celebrate their victory and to mock the God of Israel by humiliating the man who had once been his champion. The name of the Lord was scorned because the one marked for his purposes had handed his enemies the opportunity they sought. When the temple finally collapsed, many lives were lost along with Samson's own. Families were left grieving in the rubble, collateral damage from a story that could have unfolded very differently. Samson's life reminds us that our choices, especially when we carry significant gifts, never affect only ourselves. The people around us, those we are called to serve, protect, and bless, bear the weight of our compromises. The story invites every heart to consider not only what our unfaithfulness costs us, but what it costs those who live in the wake of our decisions. Even in this hard truth, the mercy of God remains. He can still bring deliverance through broken vessels, but the path is far more painful than it ever needed to be. Samson stands as one of Scripture's most sobering portraits of what happens when great potential is not matched by character, when giftedness lacks guardrails, and when strength is not anchored in humble submission to God. The ruin did not come in a single dramatic moment. It grew slowly through years of small choices until the impressive outward appearance could no longer hold. Like a tree whose roots have quietly rotted while the trunk still looks strong from a distance, Samson stood tall for a time. When he finally fell, he brought much down with him. The warning his life leaves us is not that giftedness itself is dangerous. It is that giftedness separated from the humility of daily dependence on the giver becomes deeply dangerous to the one who carries it, to the people around them, and to the greater purposes the gift was meant to serve. The calling was real, the strength was real, the ruin was also real. These things are preserved honestly in Scripture so that every gifted heart, every proud soul, every person tempted to rely on their own ability can see the danger clearly and choose a different path while there is still time. Before the pillars give way, before the slow compromises become chains, before the strength that once seemed invincible is suddenly gone. The story of Samson is not only a tragedy, it is also an urgent invitation. Let your gifts drive you back to the giver. Let your strength teach you dependence. Let your life be marked not by impressive feats alone, but by humble, faithful surrender to the God who gave you everything you have. In that place, the gifts find their true purpose, and the harvest becomes blessing rather than ruin. The prison at Gaza could easily be read as the tragic end of Samson's story. The blindness, the bronze chains, the humiliating labor of grinding grain like an animal while his enemies celebrated his fall. The once feared champion reduced to entertainment for the very people he had been raised to oppose. Yet the prison was not the end. It became the beginning of the only chapter in Samson's life that truly looked like transformation. When everything visible was taken away, the strength, the freedom, the sight, the status, what remained? A man who had spent his life trusting the gift more than the giver. A man who had confused the power flowing through him with power that belonged to him. A man who had treated his sacred calling as a personal advantage rather than a covenant responsibility. All the props that had supported the false self were gone. What was left was the one thing that had always mattered most and had been most neglected: the simple, honest relationship between a broken man and the God who had set him apart before he took his first breath. In the darkness of that prison, Samson's hair began to grow again. It was a quiet sign in the midst of deep humiliation, a visible reminder that even in the lowest place, the God who had marked him from the womb had not abandoned him. The prison became the place where Samson finally began to learn what he had needed most all along: not greater strength, but deeper dependence; not more impressive victories, but genuine surrender. In the dark, stripped of everything he once relied upon, he began the journey toward the honest prayer that would one day bring the temple down and fulfill the purpose for which he had been born. When the great festival day came, and the Philistines brought Samson out to entertain them in the temple of Dagon, something had already changed within him that no one in the crowd could see. The man who had once acted in his own strength without prayer, who had walked through his most spectacular victories with little recorded acknowledgement of the God who empowered them, now turned to the Lord in the darkest moment of his life. Between the two central pillars that held up the entire temple, he prayed. Not a proud declaration, not a bold demand. A simple, humble plea, unlike anything earlier in his story. O Lord God, remember me. Strengthen me just this once. The humility in those words reveals how deeply the transformation had taken root. He did not claim he had earned this. He did not demand payment for past service. He simply asked to be remembered. It was the language of a man who had finally understood that his standing with God was never earned by his victories and had never been completely destroyed by his failures. The same God who had marked him before birth could still hear the prayer of a blind prisoner standing between two pillars. God answered. The Spirit came upon him once more. Strength returned. Samson took hold of the two central pillars, one with his right hand and the other with his left. With all the power that had been restored to him, he pushed. The pillars gave way. The temple collapsed. In that single moment of honest dependence, Samson accomplished more in his death than he had in much of his life. The deliverance he had been born to begin reached its painful but decisive fulfillment. In the end, it was not his strength that changed everything. It was the humble prayer of a broken man who had finally learned to ask. Samson's story does not end in the darkness of the prison. It finds its final chapter in the temple of Dagon. And that ending carries a profound theological weight the entire narrative has been moving toward. The man who had so often lived for his own desires laid down his life for the people he had been called to serve. The champion who had spent years fighting battles driven by personal revenge died in a single act that brought deliverance to Israel. The self-will that had guided so many of his choices finally bowed in the last moment to the purpose God had spoken over him before he drew his first breath. This is the quiet hope that shines through the brokenness of Samson's life. Transformation is possible even after the deepest fall. The prison at Gaza and the prayer between the pillars together declare that pride surrendered, no matter how late, is still pride surrendered. The God who marked Samson from the womb had not abandoned him in the dark. He met him there and used even his final moments for good. He never finishes with us in the dark either. No matter how far the compromises have taken us, no matter how broken the chapter feels, the same God who heard Samson's humble prayer is still listening. He is still able to bring beauty from ashes, deliverance from failure, and purpose from what we thought was the end. In his hands, even the most imperfect life can still point others toward the greater deliverer who would one day come, the one whose perfect obedience and willing sacrifice would bring down the true enemy once and for all. Guard the sacred areas. Samson's unraveling did not begin with Delilah. It began long before, in the small, repeated choices that slowly eroded the boundaries God had placed around his life. Those choices never felt dramatic in the moment. They seemed reasonable enough. Yet each one moved him one step closer to the prison that would eventually hold him. Every life has sacred areas, places God has marked as set apart, commitments made in covenant, boundaries established not as heavy restrictions, but as protective walls within which true calling can flourish and bear good fruit. These areas rarely collapse in a single dramatic failure. They erode gradually, link by link, compromise by compromise, small concession, quietly following small concession, until the wall that once stood firm lies in rubble. The practical invitation of Samson's story is clear and tender. Look honestly at the sacred areas of your own life and guard them with the vigilance he struggled to maintain. Pay attention to the small concessions, the relationship pulling you away from your calling, the entertainment slowly reshaping what feels normal to your heart, the secret habit that stays hidden because it has never been brought fully into the light. Name them honestly before God. Then guard them, not through anxious striving or gritted teeth determination, but through daily, humble dependence on the one who gave you life and calling in the first place. The strength you need to remain faithful is not your own and never has been. It flows from the same source that marked Samson before birth and that still meets every heart willing to abide in him today. In this daily guarding, the sacred areas remain holy ground. The calling stays clear, and the life that was meant to bless others finds its way to the good fruit it was always intended to bear. When the familiar pull of self-sufficiency takes over, the quiet voice that says you can handle this, that you have managed harder things before, that you will be able to shake yourself free as at other times. Pause. Do not let the momentum build. Stop and pray before you take the first step down the familiar road. Ask for the Spirit's strength in the moment of temptation, rather than discovering its absence only after the consequences have arrived. And when failure has already come, when the prison feels real, the blindness weighs heavy, and the chains seem unbreakable, do what Samson finally learned to do in the darkest hour. Cry out to the God who remembers. Come with raw honesty, not polished words. Bring the brokenness exactly as it is, without trying to perform strength or having it all together. The God who met a blind prisoner between two pillars is the same God who waits for you in your lowest place. He remembers. He hears. He is not finished with the story your failures seem to have ended. In that honest dependence, strength returns, not always the kind the world can see, but the kind that truly lasts, the kind that flows from abiding in the true source rather than relying on your own, the kind that turns even the darkest prison into the place where genuine transformation begins. Return to Him. Remain in Him. Let the sacred areas of your life be guarded by daily dependence rather than occasional willpower. In this place, the gift finds its true purpose, the calling stays clear, and your life becomes a living testimony to the God who redeems even the most broken chapters. Samson's story does not end where it seemed to be heading. It ends in a prison that became a place of honest prayer, in blindness that opened a clearer vision than his eyes had ever known. in weakness that finally made room for the strength that had always belonged to God and never truly to him. He had been marked before birth for a purpose larger than his pride could carry. He spent most of his days proving how heavy that calling truly was. Yet in the end, broken, blind, stripped of every outward resource except raw honesty, he offered the simplest and most powerful prayer of his life. And the God who had set him apart from the womb answered. This is the mercy that flows quietly beneath the severity of Samson's story. Not that God overlooked the pride, the compromises, or the wasted years. He did not. But that even after all of it, a single genuine cry of dependence could still open what decades of self-sufficiency had slowly closed. Tonight, whatever prison your own pride or compromise has built around you, whatever blindness lingers from choices you cannot undo, the same God who remembered Samson between the pillars is right here with you in this quiet moment. He has not finished with your story. Bring the brokenness to him. Speak honest prayer. Abide in the one who marks his children with purpose and meets them with mercy, even in the darkest places. In his hands, what feels like the end can become the beginning of something new, something redeemed, something that still bears fruit for his glory.